Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of That Solo Life, the podcast for PR pros and marketers who work for ourselves. I am Michelle Kane. My company is Voice Matters, and I am here as ever with my lovely co-host, Karen Swim. She is the leader over at Solo PR Pro. And we are also joined by a special guest. But first, I'll say hello to Karen. Hi, Karen. How are you today?
I'm great, Michelle. Hello, listeners. So happy to be back for another week.
Yes, I know. Some of us at recording time, we're still digging out. I mean, it is January, so we should expect that. But we are ready to dig in. We are ready to dig in with our guest, Josh Greene of the Mather Group. He has a new book that we, as PR pros, are just so excited to dig into. It is called Wikipedia for Business 2021. Josh is the master of all things Wikipedia. And I'm just excited to talk about how does Wikipedia fit into your PR strategy? How important is it? So welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
We're so excited to have you. Now, it was fascinating to learn, although it really, I guess, shouldn't have surprised me, that Wikipedia is the second most trafficked website in the United States.
Yeah, it's just become everyone's go-to source for independent information, and there just seem to be more ways that it's getting used. Google's just had some new developments in terms of how it's going to incorporate Wikipedia information, so it plays a huge role in how organizations are defined.
Yeah, definitely. Tell us a little bit more about that, because in your book you do mention that Wikipedia's data populates in Google's knowledge panel, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah, so in addition to being usually one of the top three results you'll see, it also populates the information you see in the top right if you're on a desktop, that knowledge panel, which usually has a picture or a logo and then some information about a company or famous person. And that's really the first two lines of your Wikipedia page that are getting syndicated right into that result in Google. So your Wikipedia presence is not just in the search results, but in that knowledge panel on the top right side as well.
That's fantastic. And it was also really interesting to solidify the notion that, Wikipedia easily gets sloughed off just by the general public out there thinking, oh, anyone can make a change. But that's kind of a myth. That the lack of reliability of Wikipedia seems to be an outright myth. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I would say there are a couple things going on there. One is the information on Wikipedia is usually very, very good, albeit in a positive or negative direction, but it generally has most of the facts right about things. And it was founded on the principle that anyone can edit, and that's factually true, continues to be true, and probably the follow-up question to that is, and yes, how long will those edits last if you make them yourself?
Yeah, I found that part very interesting too. And I have been a Wikipedia user for many years. Way back in the early days, I try to do some edits, not on client pages or, I don't have a Wikipedia page, but on just, for fun, because I wanted to see what all the hubbub was about. And so it is really interesting that a site that says anyone can be an editor, it's technically true, but not really true. And you called out some of the complexities, particularly for businesses. Can you address some of those?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the tricky things for Wikipedia is 80% of the things a PR or marketing professional would be inclined to do are the exact opposite of what Wikipedia rules tell you should be doing. And like any online community, there are people who take great pride in being able to point out mistakes that are being made. So we'll talk through a number of the rules, but probably an easy example to start with is the need for neutrality. Wikipedia is designed to be an encyclopedia, and as such, the tone is supposed to be very neutral and fact based. And if you're in PR, that is probably not the first thing that comes to mind when you start writing about a particular client that you have.
And so, you know, as I was reading, I understand why clients value a Wikipedia page. And some were created without, they were created organically because your client has some high profile media interviews or is a high profile figure. But for the average business, is this something that they should even be worried about, a Wikipedia page? I mean, what benefit does it truly have to the business?
Generally, if you're a smaller business and don't have a page, it's not something you should be worrying about. The benefits tend to be like those of PR, that it increases your visibility a little bit, and you're sort of have a few subconscious signals when someone's searching in Google. Most small businesses are going to end up with a Google My Business page over in that top right, which will work just fine for them. If you don't have a page, it's generally a pretty big hurdle to get over. There's something in the Wikipedia guidelines called notability, and we can talk about that. But the unfortunate thing is how Wikipedia defines notability is very different than how you colloquially would define notability. So having a conversation with a client and telling them they're not notable in the eyes of Wikipedia is not never goes particularly well because no one thinks they're non-notable.
Mhm.
So what does Wikipedia consider to be notable?
There's a threshold. It's 3 or 5 independent news articles about a company from a third party source. So it's like a profile that's out there, but it's one where you're not interviewed or quoted. Wikipedia really does not believe in you being able to offer up facts on your own because you're being biased. So if you've been quoted in the press a lot, that doesn't do anything for you. If you've been interviewed by the press a lot, that doesn't do anything for you. If your local paper does a whole story about you and does not quote you in it, that's the kind of thing that Wikipedia is looking for. So there's a whole question of what's a good source for Wikipedia, and anything that's self-published is not eligible to be used, although that's a little bit of a gray area.
Yeah, now what do you do? I mean, here's the scenario that I most often hear is that clients do have a Wikipedia page and it is not entirely accurate and they're frustrated about getting it updated.
We get that quite a lot too, and usually there's a story that goes along with it. Like 2 years ago, we edited Wikipedia and we got banned, or we tried to edit Wikipedia and it didn't work. And sometimes clients just view that as a discrete thing. We tried Wikipedia once and it didn't work, and the interesting thing about Wikipedia is the answer could be totally different a day later, a week later. Different editors could be watching a page. So it's never, entirely a static answer. But one thing I would definitely recommend for your audience is you don't want to get involved in trying to do it yourself with Wikipedia. Um, that tends to be a little bit of heading down a rabbit hole and can be very time consuming.
And it also can lead to more problems according to your book as well. So, fully articulate that because, our audience is, they're communicators, they are PR people, and what would be the steps that they should take? Because more often than not, that communicator is responding to either, an internal request to fix it, or, if they're, in-house, or to a client request. And so what are some proactive steps that they could have ready, um, if that request comes across their desk?
Yeah, and so when I was 18, I worked at a gas station for a summer, and they taught me how to plug a leak in a tire, which was a fairly minor repair, and of course gave me great confidence because now I knew something about cars. We had a Saturday when I was working all by myself. Someone pulled up and said, "Hey, can you fix my tire?" And I thought, well, I'm going to be a hero here, and said, sure, just pull in on this lift, just drive right up in here and I'll fix it. They drove in and promptly ripped off the covering to their undercarriage. And now I had a much bigger problem than the fact that they had a somewhat flat tire. Half their cars seemed to be coming off. And that's kind of similar to what can happen with Wikipedia. So the first thing that you really want to do is make sure you know what the rules are so you can inform your client of what's going on there. A typical scenario is, hey, there's some inaccurate information on our page, or there's a controversy that's taking up a disproportionately large amount of information, and please fix it immediately. So really the first thing to do is see what the situation is, try and define the problem, and then look at your possible solutions for fixing it. There are a whole bunch of different approaches you can take in Wikipedia, but really one of the first things you want to do is do some client management and point out there are downsides to trying to update Wikipedia. It can bring more information to your page. It can get you banned from Wikipedia. It can get other editors involved who might go to some lengths to put negative information on the page up. So there are a whole bunch of consequences, and it's oftentimes important to discuss with a client the fact that these do exist, because oftentimes it's, hey, you're a PR professional, this is in the public domain, go fix it and let me know tomorrow how it's fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And and it looks like it should be something that could be easily fixed. Here's a button that says edit. Here's some inaccurate information. I'm going to fix it. And potentially that could work, but there are a million rules that make it less likely. You're not supposed to edit pages you have a conflict of interest about. Other people will disagree. There are rules about sourcing, so you could decide to reference your organization's website. That's a no-no. So there are a lot of pitfalls if you decide to go the do-it-yourself route.
So you might say, Josh, that it would be best for a PR pro to, seek out someone like your group who has the specific expertise in, having just this in-depth experience and knowledge of how to work, the labyrinth of Wikipedia, the editorial process.
Yeah, or very quickly get a read on what is the history of the page and what advice can you give on whether this is a very big deal, a small deal, or what is the likelihood of changes sticking. It may very well be that oftentimes you'll see revenue that's out of date from 2 years ago, which is an easy fix because a public company has probably been covered and that information is out there. Other times, you may see something that's considerably more complicated. I used to work at Discovery Channel, and there was a hostage situation in one of their buildings for 15 minutes. No one was hurt. Obviously upsetting, but not the defining moment of that company's history. And on Wikipedia, there were, I don't know, pages of information on the situation, the manifesto of the guy, where he went to high school. Probably more information on that than there was on this billion-dollar company. And something like that is one of those situations where it shouldn't be there, but how you go about editing it or moving it to its own page or trimming it down are all things where you need to be sensitive to the history of the page and who's edited it over time. And that's one of the nice things about Wikipedia is there's a talk page at the top of every page where people can have discussions about content on the page, which gives you a feel for the history in addition to viewing the history of all the edits to that page.
That's good to know.
So one tip is if you look at that talk page, you can see sort of discussions about bigger picture items. And theoretically, if you're associated with that organization, that's where you can post requests for the community to make edits. You have the ability to post there and say something like, I work with IBM and this data is from 2017. Could someone please update it? Which is sort of the whitish hat way of doing things on Wikipedia.
Interesting. So crowdsourcing your updates in a way within the Wikipedia community.
Yeah.
That's cool. Another really neat thing that your book points out is that not only is Wikipedia good for us as PR pros, reversing it for doing research, but you say it's also a useful tool to learn about trends. What's the best way for a solo to use Wikipedia to spot trends?
One of the interesting things with Wikipedia is you can see the amount of page views any single page gets. So if you click on, you view the history, and then there's a choice in there for page views, you can see how many views every single page, be it company or possibly more importantly, category is getting. So if you're doing work in the field of remote process automation, there's probably a page about that where you can see how many views it's getting per day, per week, per month, going all the way back to when that page was started in Wikipedia. So that's really good for trend spotting. And on those category pages, the talk pages often give you a feel of how the discussion's evolving around those topics. So it can be anything from, hydroponic farming to B2B software. And there's a bunch of history there that can be very useful in terms of what's going on.
One of the things that I found interesting, Josh, was in your book, you talked about the demographics of Wikipedia editors, and it is not representative of our society at large. And can you talk a little bit about that? Share what the demographics are, and if you feel like that's problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's probably millions of people who've signed up to be editors on Wikipedia at one point or another, but probably 50,000 that are very active Wikipedia editors. And the challenge is, especially up until a year or so ago when there were some technical changes, it lends itself to someone being sort of technically proficient. The code for Wikipedia looks a lot like editing HTML. You need to devote some time to figuring out how it works, and you probably need to be a little bit obsessive about something to get involved. They've made it a little bit easier with visual editors and whatnot. But it definitely appeals to the geekier side of people. When I started editing Wikipedia, I sort of met the criteria for a Wikipedia editor. I had time on my hands and a little bored and was very passionate about track and field. And Wikipedia had some inaccuracies. So naively, as one does, I decided that I was going to fix the internet, and off I charged to make my edits to clean up the track and field pages. And that tends to be the type of person who gravitates towards Wikipedia. So, for example, if you have a question about, any episode of Star Trek ever going back to, 50 years, you can probably find a detailed plot summary, information on everyone who appeared in that episode, and more realistically than you'd ever want to know. Versus if you're searching on, say, sub-Saharan female politicians, there's very little information. So there is a certain sort of skewing that creeps into Wikipedia. To its credit, the community is aware of that, and they're are a lot of things being done to try and bring in a more diverse editor population, having Wikipedia editathons, reaching out. There are lists of pages that need to be created. So if you're interested in a certain area, you can see what pages need work on or might need to be created. So there is an awareness and a lot being done, but it definitely does come from a certain viewpoint, which is not as inclusive as you probably would want to have in an encyclopedia.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, it's overwhelmingly male, and the age groups are either retirees or 20 something
Mm.
young men, correct?
Yeah. And the interesting thing about Wikipedia is it can cater to almost any um, interest you have. So there are retirees who do nothing but punctuation check and make edits and feel rewarded by the positive feedback they get from doing that, in terms of here's a scorecard of how many edits you've made. People can leave you affirmation. Other people will argue about, medical journals and edit, hours a day. So yeah, for whatever reason, those do seem to be the demographics that gravitate towards being very active Wikipedia editors.
I
Yeah.
think I've just seen my future. It's well, as you were talking about all that, it just came into mind. I don't know, not that we're here to solve this issue, but I could see. Do you see a situation where members of academia, let's say women's studies, the different pages and just to kind of flesh that out a little bit, make it more diverse, like maybe collaborate with, professors, universities, saying, hey, we need pages in these topics because they're more well versed with, having third party citations and, showing their work per se. It might be something to consider in the Wikipedia world.
Yeah, absolutely. And academic papers are considered one of the gold standards of sources on Wikipedia. And there's a lot of effort to do things like that and sort of walk people through some of the process, so that they don't necessarily get discouraged the first few times they're editing.
Right, sure. That's fascinating.
Yeah. I actually love seniors being involved because I think
Mm.
that's fantastic. I really do. And I almost feel like maybe that's something that Wikipedia should promote more to senior communities, because that does sound fantastic. And it's a great way to
Yeah,
take advantage of that vastly underused knowledge bank that retirees have, and put it to use for all of us. I think that's great.
totally. Absolutely. Well, now that we are in this new year of 2021, what are a couple of things that communications pros should know about Wikipedia that might be new for the new year?
I would say the first thing to be aware of is there's not really a central Wikipedia body. There's a foundation that oversees the infrastructure, but there's not a, hey, I'm going to appeal to the head office of Wikipedia, or I'm going to send them a nasty letter that this information is inaccurate. It doesn't work like that, despite the fact that most clients feel like, well, it's a website, so write to the website and tell them they're wrong. Doesn't really work. It's a crowdsourced thing, so you have to adapt your tactics. So I would say, one, being aware of what Wikipedia is. Two, Wikipedia's definition of things is very different than your intuitive sense. You're not
Mm.
allowed to use your blog, your company information, your press releases to back things up. Now, that's a gray area and it varies, but you basically can't quote yourself. So that's something else I would say to be aware of. And three, I would say, if you are ever going to try editing something that's not something you care about, and be very careful about that. Most of the time what happens is someone says, I'm going to fix Wikipedia. Here's the edit button. I'm going to start editing my client right away. And there's immediately like 3 rules you've broken inadvertently, which can result in the edits getting reverted and people yelling at you. So I would say be very careful before you take the step into editing. It's much easier to keep it at arm's length than try to explain how your edits may or may not have worked, and have things spiral, much like that car situation. All of a sudden, you've gone from yes, it's a nice day, to what have I done here, and how do I explain this, and can I even fix it?
Very true. Very true. You don't want to have that happen. So, how did you get started in all of this and in being so interested in Wikipedia? Was it just that at outset when you started to update the track and field pages?
It started there. I before I was in marketing, was in corporate communications for a bit, and had a lot of people that I knew who I just talked to as we moved around to different companies, who essentially had challenges with Wikipedia, and sort of was informally advising them while I was working at various places, and sort of doing here's what's going on with your page. Here are a couple of options to deal with it. And when we started the Mather Group, we were focused on search engine optimization. And Wikipedia is a real challenge for a lot of companies. So we've been able to sort of guide them through the process, and help them understand and educate in terms of what's going on, and then what they can do so they get a fair shake from Wikipedia.
Excellent, excellent. And just so we definitely give your company a fair shake, tell us a little bit about the Mather Group. What services do you provide for your clients?
Yeah, we help companies with their corporate image, which is really how they're showing up in Google and how they're showing up in Wikipedia. So a lot of what we do is education. We do a weekly open Ask Me Anything where people can show up and ask questions. There's a lot of why, because both Google and Wikipedia have their own rules, and it can be challenging to figure out why they are the way they are. And that's our focus, and it seems to fill a nice niche where if you're a communicator, you're probably not spending 40 hours a week thinking about how Google does its results or the latest updates on Wikipedia, unless you're part of a very big team. So there's been opportunity for us to help people out.
Excellent, excellent. So, sometimes we get a little silly here on the podcast. So I don't know if this is going to be a silly answer, but what is the wildest thing you've seen as far as a page getting deleted? What gets you banned?
So getting banned is actually fairly easy. But there've been, the funniest thing I think is sometimes people pull pranks and whatnot, and I thought it was very amusing that for 10 years, Lord Byron was reputed to have had a honey badger as a pet, and no one bothered to update or check it.
Who would be around to question that, right?
Right? Like, prove me wrong. And then the other one, just as an example of how things on Wikipedia can spiral, there was a 3-year argument over whether the city in Germany was Danzig, or I think I'm pronouncing it right, Gdansk. And literally they spent 3 years arguing over it before a compromise was reached. So just as an example of
Wow.
people feeling passionately about things, there's certainly plenty to argue about.
Oh my goodness. That is incredible.
Wow. That is. Wow, Josh. Well, this is a lot of great information that I'm sure is going to be really helpful to PR pros as well as to business owners. And I want to mention before we wrap up that you are also going to do a webinar for us on February the 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and folks can find the link to register by following us on our social media channels. We're Solo PR on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And we'll also drop it into the show notes because our show will come out a couple of days before the webinar. So thank you for doing that as well. And then, Josh, tell us where folks can pick up your book.
Well, if you are on Amazon and Google Wikipedia for Business 2021, you'll see it. And also, if you Google that, you should be able to find our website for the Mather Group LLC, where we've got a bunch of information. And on the webinar, we can take a look at Wikipedia questions or pages for companies in real time next week.
Excellent. Well, we are so looking forward to that. And we are so grateful to you, Josh, for spending time with us today. And we just are so grateful. We've learned so much more. I've learned more about Wikipedia in the last half hour than I have ever known. So for that, I am grateful, and I'm sure Karen is as well. And we encourage everyone to join us for this webinar on February 9th. Again, you can check it out in the show notes or visit soloprpro.com. And until next time, thanks for joining us on That Solo Life.